Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Louise Smyth and I'm a Senior Associate in the Employment team here at Field Seymour Parks. Welcome to this morning's seminar on the topic of employee retention during 2020 with all of the wonderful, peculiar challenges that this year has thrown at us. Before we begin, I should explain a few housekeeping points for those who haven't attended one of our live events before. This morning's event will be around 45 minutes to an hour long. That includes time to set aside for questions at the end. You're all on mute, but there is a question box which you should see on your screen. Please do populate that with questions as we go through, as they occur to you, and I'll do my best to get through as many as possible at the end of the webinar. If I can't get through everything, or you ask me a really tricky, awful question that requires a bit more of an in-depth answer, then I'll follow up with you on email afterwards. I should tell you this webinar is not only live, but it's also coming to you live from my front room. So please do bear with me with any sort of technical difficulties or interruptions we have. I cannot, hand on heart, guarantee that the Amazon man, who's my new best friend, is not going to start ringing the doorbell really aggressively at around 11 AM. But in true 2020 style, we shall, of course, just keep calm and carry on. So, you know, bear with me and we'll get through it. The slides are available to download. Again, you'll see them in the handout box on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and I'll send you a recording after the event. Final thing I should say is we really, really value your feedback on all of our events. It's what helps us make them better. So, you know, if you could spare a couple of minutes at the end to fill in the feedback, and there'll be a little box that pops up at the end of the webinar, you know, I'd be really grateful. Thank you. Right, so let's start by taking a look at what we're going to cover today, which is in my sort of introductory slide. It's worth noting that despite the fact the furlough scheme is called the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, you know, this isn't a webinar on that sort of employee retention. You know, there's lots of great advice and guidance out there. Check out our LinkedIn page if you need assistance, or contact me through the questions box, and we'll happily help you with any queries. But that's not what we're going to look at today. Instead, we're going to look at the broader concept of employee retention, why it matters, and what additional challenges COVID has brought to the table. We'll then look at what action employers rather, can take to maintain workplace stability. We'll look at reviewing your employment contracts. What protection do you have in there, particularly your notice periods, your post-termination restrictions. We'll consider the steps that you can take to maintain a positive workplace culture. How do you manage your employees in this new COVID world? How do you maintain lines of communication and morale? There are specific considerations around home working, which we'll touch on briefly. And then finally, we'll take a look at sort of reviewing, adapting established retention strategy. Again, you know, trying to give a sort of 2020 spin on it, and that will include getting your recruitment right, incentivizing your employees, even when potentially there isn't much money floating around, to incentivize in the normal way, and you know, just remembering to finish off the process with those all important exit interviews and learning from points and moving forward. Right, so if we move on to our next slide, why is retention an issue? You know, why do we care? You know, even back in good old 2019, employee retention or the ability of an organisation to retain its employees was a really important focus for businesses. Of course, the degree of turnover is expected. It's healthy, quite frankly, but the costs of replacing senior employees, you know, it's very high, as well as recruitment costs. You have the productivity dip when you're sort of missing a link in the chain. And there's management time involved in recruiting, onboarding, training new recruits. And quite frankly, if you have too high of a retention rate, your reputation will take a hit, because candidates and recruiters on the job market, and clients even, will start to wonder what the issue is. The old adage, there's no smoke without fire, it may well apply. I have a quick poll, actually. I'd be interested to see what you think about the cost of employee having a high employee retention rate, and what it costs to actually replace an individual employee. So, according to the Society for Human Resources Management, how many months' salary does it cost a business to replace a salaried employee? I'll give you sort of a minute or so to select what you think. Do you think it's 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 6 to 9 months, or 9 to 12 months? Okay, interesting. So there's a pretty even split. None of you think it's 1 to 3 months, which is absolutely right. A few of you have gone for the 9 to 12 month category. The rest of the results are pretty much split between 3 to 6 and 6 to 9 months. Not surprising, really, because it's not an exact science. The answer that the Society for Human Resources Management put across is 6 to 9 months per individual employee. But by way of disclaimer, I should make it clear, as you're probably all aware, a quick internet search will pull up 101 ways of calculating these costs. And there's a number of factors one takes into account, including the size of the organisation and the seniority of the employee, which is why I sort of plumped with this particular worked example, because at least it does take into account the actual salary of the employee concerned. We can get a sense of the potential impact of poor retention rates, certainly. And so moving back to our slides, in this COVID age, when we are all pretty much nose to the grindstone and lacking in funds for the most part, retention is perhaps an even bigger issue for employers, and it's one that goes beyond pure cost. Although, let's face it, those recruitment costs would be a pretty big and bitter pill to have to swallow at the moment. But lots of us are operating with a pared back workforce due to the impact of COVID, whether that's because we've had to furlough employees to survive, whether it's because we've had to make redundancies to do the same. And therefore, it becomes even more crucial to retain key employees. And even if employers aren't in that position now, I truly believe that employers who ignore retention issues and employee engagement at this what is a really tricky time for everybody, employers and employees, but I think that they will pay the costs in the years to come in terms of their retention, because when the job market picks up, when people have a bit more confidence, when there's a bit more stability, employees will go because they don't feel valued now. So with the importance of retention fixed in our minds, let's take a look at the contractual protections as our first port of call. I think in terms of reviewing contractual protections, the first step will be to undertake an audit to understand what you've got in place. Contractual provisions around notice and post-termination restrictions, are potentially can both deter employees from leaving, or equally as importantly, protect the business when key employees leave. Once you've seen what you've got, you may then wish to consider implementing changes if it's necessary. And I should stress at this point that given employee retention is the name of the game here, it definitely won't always be appropriate or recommended to try and put more onerous post-termination restrictions in place, or even increase notice period if that's done in in a one-sided manner. And taking that sort of more aggressive stance will probably only be something you'll consider if you're in that camp of employers who's operating on a sort of skeleton staff, and you need to take strong action to protect the stability of your workforce and the key employees who remain. Bear in mind, of course, that if you do seek to make changes to employees' contracts of employment, consent will be required. Employers can and do often seek to enforce changes by dismissing and offering to re-engage on the same terms, or the new terms rather, in this instance. But do bear in mind, and it's particularly relevant at the moment with our workforces in flux, that those dismissals and re-engagements will count as redundancies for the purposes of calculating how many redundancies have been made in a 90-day period, and looking at whether those collective consultation obligations are triggered. So the first contractual provision to consider is notice. How much notice do your employees need to give to terminate employment? I've put a little note there to say, do be aware of a potential loophole, a potential sticky issue with statutory minimum notice provisions, because I have seen employers get caught out here. Now, statutory notice provisions apply, and employees will be entitled to an extra week's notice for each year of service, up to a maximum of 12 weeks. When it comes to the notice that employees have to give you as employers, that is only ever, the statutory minimum is only ever 1 week. It doesn't increase with length of service in the same way. So once you've looked at what notice you're actually entitled to, the next step is to consider whether those provisions give you adequate time to arrange cover, to find a replacement. And if they don't, then you look at whether this can be increased. Bear in mind that employees will expect to see any sort of increase to notice cut both ways. And if you're prepared to do that, then it's actually probably a relatively easy change to make. There's a benefit to employees in having a longer notice period in these troubled times as well. Post-termination restrictions are a little bit trickier. We'll focus primarily on restrictive covenants. It is worth, I've put it as a bullet point there, confidentiality and IP. I'm not going to look at it in detail, but if you're conducting an audit, doing a general health check of what protection you have in place, I would always recommend that you look at your confidential information provisions, your IP provisions, and just check that everything you need covered is covered, that you have those restrictions there in the first place, quite frankly. Fine. Okay, so let's look at restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants limit an employee's ability to do certain things for a limited period after the termination of employment. Typical restrictions might include non-compete restrictions, where the employee is prevented from working for a competitor or setting up in competition themselves. Non-solicitation or non-dealing restrictions, which prevent employees from soliciting work from, or indeed dealing with clients, or sort of getting in the way of the supply relationships. There are also non-poaching of employees restrictions. So your ex-employees don't move on somewhere and then cherry pick the best of their former colleagues to bring with them. And all of those restrictions are incredibly useful ways of protecting your business, but you do need to ensure that they're enforceable for that protection to have any sort of real meaning. And the key principle is that restrictions can't go any further than is necessary to protect a legitimate business interest. So employers really need to think, particularly if they are considering implementing new restrictions now, really need to think about what it is they're trying to protect, and how they do that, bearing in mind that the length and the scope and the reach of those restrictions will be subject to scrutiny. The seniority of the employee, the nature of the role he or she performs, all of those will be factors. As a really sort of sweeping statement, by way of guidance, it is tricky to have restrictions that last longest to sort of 6 to 12 months, unless you're an organisation with a global reach. I'd be expecting to see a limited sort of geographical scope. Lots of things to take into account. It really is a sort of case by case analysis, and something that is well worth taking advice on. It's worth noting that the enforceability of the restrictions is judged at the time that they're entered into. So if you go overboard and put in place some really onerous restrictions on a junior employee that are overkill and go far beyond what would be enforceable, in the fullness of time, if that individual then becomes a key employee with massive amounts of confidential information at his fingertips and huge client connections, that doesn't save you. He can't grow into his, or she can't grow into their restrictions. So that's worth bearing in mind when you are tailoring those restrictions. The other really important point is that to have a sort of valid restrictive covenant, there does need to be consideration, and the way consideration is dealt with is sort of it's treated differently, distinctly, when you look at restrictions that you enter into at the point you commence employment, and those that are introduced at a later date. In terms of restrictions that are included within the sort of the original employment contract, that contract itself and all the terms of the employment and the salary and the benefits and everything, that is deemed to be consideration for those restrictions. So in a lot of ways, it's simpler to get it right from the outset. You can introduce restrictions validly at a later date, but you do need to have specific consideration for those restrictions later down the line. You can't rely on the continuation of the same employment contract on the same terms. Okay, so let's just test that you're all still awake and that I've been clear with our sort of second poll here. This poll is going to ask you, when can you seek to introduce valid restrictive covenants? First option, only at the outset of the employee relationship. Option 2, at any point, provided the employee agrees to the change. Or option 3, at any point, provided there is valid consideration. I'll just give you a few moments to respond. Okay, well, that's really interesting because there is a pretty much dead on, well, 47% to 53% split between options 2 and 3. So at any point provided the employee agrees to the change, or at any point provided there's valid consideration. and to be fair, that's not entirely unexpected, because this was a really mean trick question. Because of course you do ordinarily need employee consent. Yeah. However, I think the way that the question's phrased, at this point we're only seeking to introduce valid restrictive covenants. The implication being that this will be put out to employees to accept or refuse. So on that basis, option 3 is the correct answer. Just to emphasise the requirement for valid consideration. But yeah, probably a bit of a mean question there. Right. If we move on to our next slide then. Let's turn to how we manage employees. I think one really important way, something that can't be underestimated, to ensure that your employees feel engaged and motivated, is just to ensure that you cover the basics and treat people fairly. COVID has put employers under a huge amount of pressure during the course of 2020, but these fundamental employment rights and obligations haven't gone away, and I can guarantee you that employees won't forget if they perceive you to be taking advantage of the situation and undermining their rights. With that in mind, clearly a full rundown of all employee rights and obligations is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I did think it was worth running through some areas where COVID has thrown up a bit of a challenge, and how employers can deal with that, or some suggestions as to how we can deal with that. So first and foremost, let's take health and safety. Employers have a duty of care to employees to safeguard their welfare at work. And we'll look at specific issues regarding home workers in due course. But in general terms, there is an obligation to assess risk of harm and provide a safe working environment. Employers need to follow government guidance and conduct risk assessments and ensure that they have a workplace that is COVID secure if they're expecting employees to come into the workplace at the moment. Employers also need to recognise that some employees will feel anxious about returning to work or returning to the workplace. Some may have underlying conditions that actually do make it genuinely more dangerous for them, that leave them more vulnerable. And they need to ensure in those cases that they are consulting with the employees on their concerns, hopefully to allay any concerns, but also to feed any sort of genuine issues back through the risk assessment programme, and make sure that they're assessing where is the safest place for the employee to be conducting their work, and whether it's safe for them to be on site. And what I would say is, having come out of sort of lockdown part 1 and the sort of initial round of furlough, lots of our clients, I think, use this sort of dual approach to really good effect in managing to get their employees back into the workplace after a period of lockdown or a period of furlough, when perhaps actually they had a number who expressed concerns or reluctance to come back in the first instance. So, yes, it's an obligation, but it can actually be something really positive. And that, I guess that's the key to good management of your employees. So let's move on to our next slide. Okay, so training and development is still really important. Firstly, fundamentally, employers need to ensure that the employees have the skills to do their jobs, particularly in this, very strange year where the parameters may well have shifted. They might be picking up things from colleagues who either have been made redundant, who aren't in the workplace. They might be asked to be fulfilling their duties in a completely different way, picking up new technology, learning how to access the systems remotely. And so at a very sort of basic level, there needs to be training and learning and development in place to make sure that they can actually perform the role. But also training and learning and development along with recognition is a key tenet of employee retention. And employers have, let's face it, many employers, not all, but a lot of employers have asked an awful lot of their employees over a sustained period of time this year. And there is an old saying, you can't drink from an empty cup. So there does need to be recognition, I think, on the part of employers, that those employees need to have their efforts recognised. They need to receive the support that they need to fulfil their role, and they need to feel that there are opportunities to develop moving forward. A lot of us feel like we are sort of standing still for 2020. So it's a really key principle and a really good way of maintaining motivation and engagement. To know that your employer has one eye on the future and one eye on your career in the future. Back to more serious matters, perhaps. Disciplinary and capability matters and grievances, all of those still need to be dealt with. And if they aren't dealt with promptly, you might lose the opportunity to deal with them at all. If you allow a disciplinary or a capability issue to go on unchecked for too long a period of time, then the reality is you may have to draw a line under that behaviour when it comes to actually trying to take the matter in hand, because you'll be effectively, if you haven't let the employee know that they're doing something that they shouldn't be doing, you then run into difficulty if you're trying to discipline or dismiss for that issue. Equally, grievances still need to be investigated and dealt with in good time. Employers do have a lot on their plate at the moment, and lockdown and remote working and all of those things will buy a certain degree of time, perhaps, but ultimately, if you're operating remotely, if the courts and the tribunals are hearing cases remotely, then there is an expectation, a legitimate expectation, that you can deal with disciplinary meetings and investigations and grievance hearings remotely as well. I suppose just another point just to bear in mind is, I can see the impact of COVID being raised quite successfully as a mitigating factor in sort of disciplinary and capability meetings moving forward, and it's a new point because we've never been here before, but it will, there will be an impact on how we work, and I think it's right, whatever the outcome is at the end, but if it's raised at a point, it does need due consideration, and that's when things like what training has been put in place, what communication has there been with managers, actually, that all becomes really relevant if you are trying to, for example, capability manage an employee who says, well, actually, this has all been terrible, I can't cope with dealing with things remotely. That might be very valid if they've been given no assistance, but if proper management support as best as we can, the proper training and learning and development has all been in place, that then becomes less of less of a mitigating factor, less of an argument against disciplinary action or putting somebody on a performance improvement plan. Right, so let's remote employees. Well, I'll leave that for the moment because I've got a whole section later on some of the issues concerning working from home, but obviously things like communication, which we'll go on and look at now, become even more relevant for employees who are not in the office or not on site, because it becomes that so much more difficult. equally with monitoring and managing performance, how are you going to do that? Hopefully you're not going to be like the employer who hit the headlines a few weeks ago, who just monitors his employees on a little live webinar, much like this. For all of the day, there has to be a degree of trust, but equally, you need to think about how you're going to be checking that employees are doing what they say they're doing or what they need to be doing. Right, so let's look at communication. And it's difficult with home working at the moment, but it's important for every sort of employee, regardless of where they're performing their duties. And it is, in terms of maintaining productivity, maintaining morale is absolutely essential to maintain a regular cadence of communication. Again, even just at a basic level, the rules are changing so frequently. Employers need to be able to communicate important business critical information, whether that be about redundancy, whether that be about new rules in the workplace, whether that be about other business critical decisions, financial decisions, and they need to be able to get that out to all employees at the same time. You want to be communicating to your on-site employees, to your furloughed employees, to your working at home employees at a similar time. Or you're going to create industrial relations issues for sure. If one sort of section of your workforce are left out in the cold. It also combats feeling of isolation, maintains productivity, but actually on a sort of more general basis, communication is central to so many of the other obligations as an employer, the other things that you need to do. It underpins mutual trust and confidence, it underpins health and safety. How can you properly assess risk and deal with issues if you're not communicating with your employees? Similarly, how are you going to manage performance? How are you going to notice if there's a dip in morale? It really is a crucial key thing that you just need to be on top of, quite frankly. Each organisation will have different ideas on how they do that best. But some suggestions might be, make sure you're scheduling regular COVID. I've put COVID safe in the handout, but I think the proper terminology is probably COVID secure team meetings and socials. I mean, the much maligned Zoom quiz really does have its place. If you can't have an open door policy, have an open screen policy. Employees need to know that they can set up time with their managers if they need it. And conversely, managers need to know what's expected of them. And to a certain extent, they might require some training, some support to ensure that they are in the right position, to offer support to employees and to spot problems, Right. Managers are employees too, and we need to make sure that we're giving them the tools to do their job in this really sort of strange, tricky new normal. Right. If we just move on now to some home working considerations. We've already looked at health and safety on a sort of general level, and we've touched on the duty to take reasonable care for our employees and to undertake risk assessments. But I guess the question is, how are you going to make these risk assessments when your employees are at home? How are you going to assess whether or not it's safe for them to work from home? Some practical suggestions might be that you make use of an employee questionnaire. Perhaps you hold Zoom meetings. That may not be such a practical idea if actually you've got a massive body of home workers, but perhaps it's something that you look at for employees who might be a sort of higher risk category. And And then in terms of assessing the risk, some sort of flashpoints really for home workers might be, have you checked whether they've got the right equipment to work safely from home? What are they using? And particularly if you're relying on them using their own devices. Have you given them advice on managing the risks associated with display equipment? Work-life balance is quite a big one. There's anecdotal for the moment reports of employees working longer and longer hours at home, and I for one can believe it, and that has an impact on health and wellness and stress levels, but it also possibly has an impact in terms of triggering possibly working time, national minimum wage issues, and employers need to find some way of keeping an eye on it. Which brings us on to, are your managers keeping in contact? Are they mental health aware? Do they know what to do if they're concerned about a particular employee? And conversely, do your employees know how they raise concerns, how they ask for help? Because it may be that the sort of traditional reporting line or the traditional HR contact map, maybe that doesn't work in this situation. So it's something to look at. And another particular consideration with home working is whether or not it triggers reasonable adjustments for disabled employees, because they are subject to they're put to a disadvantage by the home working setup that perhaps they didn't face on site. And so that triggers requirement to look at reasonable adjustments, to make reasonable adjustments if there are any, and that they may well not have existed in the normal sort of working environment. The home office setup is often a sort of flashpoint. Employers are responsible for ensuring that employees have the equipment and the technology that they need to work from home, and that doesn't just mean the devices. It means, are they on the network? Are they able to safely and securely deal with sensitive information? The onus is on the employer to make sure that they've got the policies and the processes in place to enable that to happen. It's more of a grey area in terms of who's actually forking out for the equipment. I think it's it's relatively normal for employers to expect employees to use their own laptops or computers if they have them, particularly in a sort of more professional type role. But it is worth making sure that you're clear on that, and considering what happens if your employees don't have the necessary equipment. How, what are you going to do? How are you going to bridge that? Can you loan computers? Can you loan laptops? On what terms? And this is something that we'll come to on another slide, but actually just being clear in terms of expectations and being clear on who's responsible for what can actually avoid a lot of aggravation later down the line. So moving on, another point to be mindful of is the risk of unintended contractual changes. 2020 caught us all a little bit on the hop, but we're sort of in it now. We've been in it for a long time, and there's possibly a bit of a chance to draw breath. Are employees clear on the basis on which they're working from home? What happens, what's the expectation when lockdown lifts, when the government guidance on working from home changes? Do your employees know that this isn't a permanent or long-term arrangement, or is it? It may well be that that's your intention, but it is worth bearing in mind that we don't know how long the current situation is going to last, and working practices can and do become contractual over time due to custom and practice. So employers do need to be clear on their intentions and their expectations, rather than sort of sleepwalk into a situation where an employee thinks that he or she is on a home working contract permanently. And it doesn't have to be anything more at this stage than an indication that you're keeping matters under review and will reach more permanent decisions or longer term decisions in line with changing guidance. But it's something that's worth flagging. We've looked at the cost of equipment and the responsibility for equipment, but there are, of course, other expenses that are associated with working from home. My increased electricity and heating bill will attest to that fact. And it's worth, what have the parties agreed will be the position on who bears the cost of that. Bear in mind that there are potential tax implications depending on the level, if any, of contribution from an employer. And what about travel into the office when you've been told to work from home for the foreseeable? You will perhaps potentially have to go in on occasion. Normally, on a sort of standard working from home contract, it would be quite usual to see those sorts of expenses reimbursed under the expenses policy. Slightly different situation here, but again, it's something that it's an important discussion to have. It's important that everyone's clear on who's paying for what and how, and that again just saves on the potential for resentment or animosity on what's actually a relatively minor point. What I would say is that none of the points that I've made here I think constitute rocket science. They're all fundamentally practical points, and actually employers would probably be best served by dealing with them by way of an updated policy or communication that can just effectively set out what the position is. So it's well worth reviewing and adapting what you have, or sending something out. It doesn't have to be a formal policy. An email would suffice. Just sort of ticking off those key points. So moving into sort of the final points of the seminar, and speaking of reviewing and adapting, that brings us nicely on to considering sort of well-established retention strategies and how we might review and adapt those so that they work during COVID. And the first point I'd like to make is regarding recruitment. Retention, I think, probably starts with recruitment. It starts with taking the time to ensure that you are recruiting the right person into the business who fits with the cultural, who'll grow with the business, and it is worth taking the time even now to do that in as far as it's possible. Also, onboarding during COVID, possibly remotely, might be tricky, but in communication, training and development, these are all key issues. So it's important to think about how best as you can facilitate a smooth onboarding process. The other end of the employment relationship, exit interviews, just a really quick point. If you don't have anything in place, I would really suggest you do put something in place, because it allows you to identify issues and trends, and when you do that, that allows you to have a sort of halfway decent succession planning session, and you can hopefully put right anything that's going wrong. Those are all existing principles of retention. It's worth just bearing in mind that they are important, and taking the time now is still important on those beginning and end processes. So Other things that are key sort of tenets of retention strategy, just generally, not necessarily in COVID. Transparency, communication, and recognition we've looked at, and that's sort of been peppered throughout the course of the webinar. Flexible working, actually, we're all working more flexibly than perhaps some of us would like at the moment, but that can be a key. It can be a key incentive, and certainly when financial incentives are thin on the ground, certainly I've seen clients, particularly in more conservative, professional type businesses where maybe flexible working hasn't been so widely adopted. A commitment to actually moving, a commitment to flexible working to some degree or other moving forward, in recognition of sort of how well employees have dealt with it this year. That's a great incentive for some employees. It doesn't actually cost you any money. Career development. I mean, if you read any of the millions of articles and reports on retention, career development and having a clear pathway for progression is actually one of the top principles. It's one of the top things employees look for. Comes above in a lot of ways. Good news, financial benefits. So again, that's something that we can be doing now, planning for the future, that boosts employee engagement. And okay, we can't get out to seminars and training courses and residentials, but there are a lot of remote professional development opportunities out there, and whether it be actively sort of pointing your employees in the direction of something you think they'll find useful, or whether it just be indicating to them that that's something they can look at. Those are really easy things that an employer can do, again, to reassure employees that they have one eye on the future and on their future with the organisation. Now, moving on, next slide, pay and benefits. I mean, this is to a certain extent, the key one for a lot of people. And it's been tough this year. People haven't received pay rises, people have taken pay cuts, people have lost their jobs, and employers probably, for the most part, aren't feeling too flush with the cash. So, what, in terms of pay and benefits, what can employers look at doing to pay bonuses, to incentivize employees? There's several thoughts on this. As your pay and your bonuses now. So if particularly things are picking up, you reinstate perhaps pay reductions. You increase salary where you have where you've pulled it. You look at introducing a bonus scheme where you pay out on a bonus scheme perhaps has been paused. That's one option. Another option is to look at sort of paying bonuses in the future. So this is almost a promise of better times to come, and that. So in that sense, you might see bonuses that are tied to future performances, even if it's just confirmation that the bonus scheme will run next year, and these will be the the parameters. These will be the commission targets. That there will be a review and a revert of salary, that there will be a reimbursement of salary reduction if certain targets are met at the end of the financial year next year, if that's not already part of your discussions. Share schemes are another interesting topic. So, putting something in place whereby employers aren't getting anything necessarily in their hands at the moment, but they have, there is the opportunity to benefit in the future when the good times return. Additional holiday is something that's valuable to a lot of employees, and again, relatively low cost. Health and wellness benefits, I mean, that's obviously a big issue at the moment. those sorts of benefits can be expensive, but it is worth just noting, it might be worth talking to an insurance provider, talking to your own insurers about what you can do. Certainly, I know employee assistance programs can be a relatively cheap add-on to any sort of insurance-backed benefits that you already have. So that's something that could be worth looking at. And then, let's not underestimate the small perks and getting creative and having, your marketing team send out some donuts with to arrive for the Monday morning meeting once in a while. I know certainly from a personal perspective, those sorts of things actually count at the moment in this, in this strange year. So it's not to be discounted if but what I would be really interested in now is actually, I'm going to run a poll, because I would be really interested to hear what benefits and incentives you've introduced or are considering introducing for staff. So, pay increases and bonuses effective now, pay increases, bonuses, share schemes effective in the future, additional holiday, flexible working, health and wellness benefits, small feel-good perks, or nothing at all. So I'll give you a few moments just to sort of share what your organisation is doing, just so you know. All of the answers come through anonymously, so I won't know who's doing what, and I wouldn't share that in any event. But it might be helpful just to learn from one another what, if anything, is being done out in the market. Okay, well, that's interesting. So no, obviously you'll see the results in front of you. So pretty much an even split on the sort of pay, bonus, shares point. 31% doing something now, 31% doing something future based. Lots of you are doing things around additional holiday, flexible working, health and wellness benefits. Again, great to see over half of you putting in place small feel-good perks, and only 8% of you not doing anything at all. And quite legitimately, because perhaps you can't. But that's really interesting to get a flavour to see that employers are looking to do. Still looking to incentivise staff and are realising how important that is. I thought I might share with you, just to bring it to a close before I open up to questions, what I've seen just over the course of the sort of last month or so, in terms of queries from clients. And so something I've had in from at least 2 clients is queries on attendance bonuses for non-furloughed staff, and looking to put something in place to recognise either that actually, because of the nature of the business, they're doing pretty well out of the current situation, and employees are working really hard and are, effectively frontline key staff to a certain extent, because they're keeping going, they've kept going throughout, and so in this instance they were looking at paying an additional £1 or £2 on top of the hourly rate for the period of lockdown, or reviewable on a monthly basis. And I had a similar query from somebody who was looking to do the same, but was concerned about how that might impact on the relationship with furloughed workers. And I suppose there is a small risk of discrimination element there. I think for the most part, it's fine, but you just need to be careful if you've got, if your furloughed workers happen to be predominantly made up of a set of individuals with a particular protected characteristic. So if you have you've actually managed to furlough the majority of your female staff, for example. But that's quite interesting. Also, we've seen inquiries about putting share schemes in place. Employers putting their hands up and say, look, we don't have anything to give you at the moment, but you've stuck with us in the bad times. We'll look to now reward you in the good times. And again, that's a really really important point from a retention perspective, and very often locks key employees into organisations for a longer period of time, because they want to see their their benefits come to fruition. And the other thing I've seen is a lot of talk about this commitment to maintaining flexible working moving forward, and some employers did that already, but many didn't, and and so there's definitely some value in recognising that employees have handled this well, and therefore there can be some flexibility moving forward. Okay, so I'll move to wrap up now, and we'll open the floor to any questions. I'm just going to open my little question box so I can see if you've typed anything. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here to get us started. First question is, would sort of promotion and associated pay rise count as consideration for new restrictions? That's very often how employers seek to bring changes and new restrictions with them, is on the back of a promotion, on the back of a pay rise, and that's quite a natural time to do it. I think case law on this is evolving all the time. I do, and I think generally that's fine. I do think care needs to be taken to make sure that you are tying whatever the consideration is specifically to the restrictions. So yes, possibly, probably, but being clear that is restrictions for, that is consideration for the restrictions is probably the safest option. And if you're really concerned, you can always assign a nominal amount to the new restrictions as well. I've got another question here about an employer's duty to provide a decent broadband connection. It's a really interesting point. Yes, if employers are requiring employees to work from home, I think there are two elements to it. There is the question of the cost of providing the broadband connection and how that's dealt with. I mean, I think if an employee already has broadband in the house, and they can tap into that, I'm not necessarily sure there's an obligation on an employer to pay for something above and beyond. But if they don't have something, then obviously, or something's not fit for purpose, then that needs to be looked at carefully. I think there might be an issue though. What is the issue with the broadband? Because if the individual lives somewhere, for example, that's rural or remote and can't easily tap into a decent broadband connection, I think perhaps the wider question is that a role that they're actually able to do from home? So I think it's a nuanced answer, and it will depend on the circumstances. But it may well be that if employers are determined for the employee to work from home, then obviously they're going to be motivated to ensure that the setup is right. But it might be the case that it's not a situation where home working is easily arrived at. Okay, so I've had another question again. Broadband is so there's an assumption that all employees have access to broadband. So the company stop paying costs for home workers. Are they obligated to do so? Well, it will depend on what the contract and their policies say. You know, it's a difficult situation for everyone to a certain extent. There is probably that in all likelihood you will have a home working policy in place that was put in place for the 15% of employees who work from home, and that policy probably says something along the lines of, you know, if you work from home, then you'll be responsible for the cost of your own broadband service. And if that's the case, then no, your employer isn't obligated to pay for it, potentially. But if you haven't, you know, if they are requiring you to work from home, it puts a different spin on it. So I think it might be a question, because it will depend on the sort of case by case analysis of the situation, but that might be a question that we can have a bit of a chat about, but via email offline. You know, if you've got I'm very happy to consider the policy or the communication in place. The other thing to watch is, of course, if this is what they've communicated to employees at the beginning of lockdown and everyone's just accepted it and got on with it, it's probably difficult to challenge now, because you'll be deemed to accept that particular contractual term of home working. But as I say, you know, I can see who's asked the question, so I'll perhaps drop you an email later to follow up on that if you'd like me to have a look at the particular policy document and give you a bit of a steer. Any more questions? I'll just hang on for a couple more minutes. Don't know if you're anything like me, who, you know, is only one step beyond typing with two fingers. It might take a little while, but I'll hang on for a moment. I'll just see how we do in terms of the dropout rate of attendees, and if it looks like everybody is heading off, then I'll sort of wrap the session up. I can see people exiting at a rate of knots, so I'll give it a few more seconds, but I suspect we may be coming to the end of the webinar. If you think of anything and you want to drop us an email, then, you know, I'd be happy to help if something comes to you later on during the course of the day. Right, well, I think we'll probably wrap it up. Oh, hang on. Okay. So that's an interesting point that's been raised. Not necessarily a question, but just a sort of comment on the implications of long COVID. You know, and absolutely that is something that will have an impact on the workforce, and is something employers need to watch out for. You know, at the moment, we simply don't know enough about the disease. From what, you know, and I'm no medical expert, but from what I've read so far, you know, and predictions in terms of you know, how long this might last moving into the future. I suppose a key thing to flag is that, you know, there's a great chance that long COVID you know, would amount to a disability discrimination within the meaning of the Equality Act, for sure, if it's, you know, provided it you know, it's having a substantial impact on day-to-day activities, you know, which you know, by the very nature of you know, the reports of what it is, and yes, so, you know, certainly something to look at, and the person who's flagged this is is a consultant occupational health physician, and is you know, flagging it as something that you know, they consider will have major implications. So yes, to respond to your comment, that would, you know, that would be something that would be very interesting to discuss at a later date. And you know, we don't know you know, when the end is in sight, do we? And we don't know how many of us are going to be affected by this personally in the you know, during the course of you know, the next sort of 6 to 12 months while they roll out vaccines, hopefully. You know, so you're right, you know, if this is something that's possibly a disability, it could have a really long-reaching impact on the workforce if a large proportion of people are suffering from these sort of long COVID symptoms. Just sneaked a quick check at my my watch. I can see that we're 7 minutes past 11 now, so we didn't run too far over time, but we can probably draw things matters to a close. And my assistant, the lovely Lauren, is behind the scenes, making sure that my slides pop up at the right time, because I'm definitely somebody who needs some remote some remote working and technical training. So I will trust her to now end the session for us, and just to thank you all for coming along, and just to reiterate, if you could leave some feedback, that would be great. The only other thing I was going to say is we are running a series of podcasts on how to be good, the basics of being a good employer, which is quite relevant to some of the things we touched on today. So do look out for those, or let us know if you want to be on the list to be notified when they're available. All right, thanks everybody.